Imagine you are a paleontological deep-sea diver, dropped 380 million years into the past, right into the middle of the Devonian period. It's an ocean alien to us, dark, choked with bizarre microscopic life, and yet surprisingly lush. You are floating calmly, watching the early, relatively docile sharks and the giant shelled cephalopods drift past. You feel safe. You shouldn't. Because the true apex predator of this ancient water column wasn't packing teeth like a great white. It wasn't a dinosaur, since those were still 150 million years away from their awkward embryonic beginnings. It was a fish. But describing it as just a fish is like describing a nuclear warhead as just a loud firework. This creature, Dunkleosteus torelli, the undisputed champion of the late Devonian, didn't bite its prey. It didn't chew. It guillotined them.
This absolute unit used its own skull, hardened and sharpened over millions of years, as a massive hydraulic shear system, capable of generating a biting force so immense that modern researchers initially thought their calculations had to be wrong. This creature wasn't just metal, it was pure, evolutionary nightmare fuel. If you're a dino normie who thinks T-Rex is the scariest thing to ever live, prepare to meet the armored demigod who treated the ancestors of sharks like cheap aquatic roadkill. We are diving deep into the most bizarre, heavily armored fish in history, discussing why its face was literally a weapon, how it hunted, and why, despite its terrifying dominance, evolution still decided to hit the RIP button on its entire lineage. The first thing we need to establish is the stage upon which this aquatic horror show unfolded, the Devonian period. This era, lasting roughly from 419 to 359 million years ago, is often called the Age of Fishes.
But this wasn't the age of cod or salmon. This was the age of armored monstrosities. Picture the world. Pangaea is beginning to coalesce, but the land is still relatively barren. There are forests, yes, but they are strange, dominated by massive club mosses, ferns, and the incredibly tall, bizarre fungus known as prototaxites, a giant pillar-like organism that could reach 20 feet high, dominating the terrestrial skyline like something out of a low-budget 1950s sci-fi movie. It was weird. But the ocean? That was the place to be. Oxygen levels in the atmosphere were lower than today, and the seas were warm and shallow across huge continental shelves. This stability allowed for a massive radiation of marine life. This is when the first true tetrapods, the early amphibians, started experimenting with walking onto land, probably just to grab a quick snack or escape the deep-sea bullies. And Dunkleosteus, it belonged to a class of fish called placoderms.
Placoderms, whose name literally translates to plate-skinned, were the definition of biological tanks. Unlike the vast majority of modern fish, which have internal skeletons made of bone or cartilage, the placoderms wore their skeleton externally, primarily covering the head and thorax with dense, bony plates fused into a solid carapace. It's the difference between wearing a leather jacket and driving a fully armored personnel carrier. Dunkleosteus, specifically D. torelli, is primarily known from exceptionally preserved fossils found in the Cleveland Shale of Ohio, USA. This area was once the bottom of a vast inland sea. The sheer density of fossil material here, especially the heavy articulated head shields, allowed scientists to truly grasp the monumental scale of this animal. The best estimates suggest Dunkleosteus was between 20 and 33 feet long, 6 to 10 meters. To put that in perspective for you modern folks, that's about the length of a typical city bus, or maybe 3.5 Honda Civics parked bumper to bumper. And the weight? While size estimates vary, based on the sheer thickness of the armor plating, which could be up to 2 inches thick in some spots, researchers estimate the weight of a mature absolute unit could hit 4 tons. That's roughly the weight of a mature rhinoceros. The head shield alone, which is the part most commonly found, often weighs hundreds of pounds. When paleontologists dig up these plates, these geometric, often beautiful pieces of natural artwork, they are literally holding the face of an extinct apex predator that outweighed and out-armored nearly everything else that swam. This armor wasn't for show, it was structural, providing necessary protection from the sheer chaos of the Devonian environment, which, granted, included other slightly smaller placoderms that also had terrifying jaw mechanisms. It had a highly flexible neck joint relative to its armored peers, which allowed the massive head plate to articulate slightly with the trunk shield, giving it the minimum mobility needed to strike and feed.
Now, let's get to the true nightmare fuel part, the mouth. Dunkleosteus is often represented in popular science with rows of sharp teeth, much like a great white. This is incorrect, and frankly, boring. Dunkleosteus had something far more inventive, far more terrifying, and ultimately, far more biomechanically efficient. Dunkleosteus had no teeth in the traditional sense. It possessed large, bony plates, sharpened sections of its jawbone, which functioned like a self-sharpening biological guillotine or shears. The upper and lower jaws were composed of these two massive, curved dental plates. When the animal closed its mouth, these plates didn't just meet, they scraped past each other, maintaining a razor-sharp edge throughout the animal's life.
This is why the jaw structure is often described as a beak or shear-like mechanism. A team of researchers from the Field Museum and the University of Chicago published a landmark study in 2006 detailing the biomechanics of this bite. What they discovered was simply mind-blowing. Because the Dunkleosteus jaw mechanism was not constrained by muscles fighting bone-on-bone friction, and because of the unique lever structure of the hinged head armor, it could open its mouth with incredible speed and power. They calculated that Dunkleosteus could open its mouth in just 1/50th of a second. That's faster than a blink. This rapid suction created a massive vacuum, literally dragging the unlucky prey toward the crushing zone. This sudden, explosive movement is often referred to as gape and suck feeding, but in the case of Dunkleosteus, it was followed by a definitive bone-shattering crunch. The estimated maximum bite force calculated in the 2006 study was extraordinary, potentially reaching 8,000 pounds per square inch, (psi), at the tip of the blades. To provide context, a modern great white shark bites at around 4,000 psi. A saltwater crocodile, the reigning champion of modern bite force, hits maybe 3,700 psi. Dunkleosteus doubled the output of the modern nightmare king. This bite wasn't designed for chewing muscle or tearing flesh. It was designed to pierce armor, shatter bone, and decapitate. Think less piranha, more industrial metal press. When this absolute unit targeted armored prey, like smaller, similarly plated placoderms, or the huge shelled ammonoids and nautiloids of the era, it didn't need to find a soft spot. It simply cleaved through the shell structure. Its unique evolutionary path meant that its teeth were literally parts of its skull, permanently. This level of crushing force and speed meant that few organisms in the Devonian Ocean could resist. Let's talk about the competition, or rather the distinct lack thereof. During the late Devonian, sharks were just getting started. Early sharks like Cladocelidae were fast, torpedo-shaped, and had relatively primitive teeth. They were effective hunters of smaller, unarmored fish, but compared to Dunkleosteus, they were basically just oversized sardines. Imagine Cladocelidae, maybe 6 feet long, swimming along. It catches the eye of the Dunkleosteus lurking below. For the shark, this encounter is not a fight. It's a sudden and irreversible promotion to roadkill status. The Dunkleosteus launches itself, opens that immense, reinforced maw with that rapid speed, and simply shears the smaller shark in half. One bite. RIP. The heavily armored fish didn't have to worry about complex hunting strategies. Its primary strategy was raw power and the element of surprise.
The fossil record supports this idea of brutal predation. Paleontologists have frequently found Dunkleosteus coprolites, fossilized feces, which often contained large amounts of partially digested bone fragments, including those belonging to other placoderms. This suggests that cannibalism, or at least scavenging on their own kind, was a distinct possibility, and that their digestive system was robust enough to handle the intake of massive chunks of armor plating. It truly was a creature capable of eating anything in its world, including itself. In addition to sharks, Dunkleosteus preyed heavily on the immense shelled mollusks. Nautiloids of the Devonian were enormous. The orthocones could be 10 feet long, looking like massive, straight-shelled ice cream cones floating through the water. These shells were fantastic defense mechanisms against nearly everything else, but they were no match for the Dunkleosteus guillotine.
The bony blades would have easily cracked the shell and crushed the soft, tentacled interior. The ecosystem the Dunkleosteus lorded over was therefore one defined by armor. If you were a fish in the Devonian, you either had to be lightning fast and small, or you had to be a walking tank. The pressure applied by this apex predator literally shaped the direction of evolution for every other organism in the water. When we talk about the discovery, we must mention the Cleveland Shale, which gives us the clearest window into the Devonian world. The fossils here are often three-dimensional and stunningly preserved due to the anoxic, oxygen-depleted conditions of the ancient seabed, which inhibited decay. The genus was named in honor of David Dunkel, a curator of vertebrate paleontology at the Cleveland Museum of Natural History.
The species epithet, Terrelli, honors J. Terrell, who was a collector who brought several important specimens to the attention of scientists in the 1860s and 70s. When the first partial skulls were assembled, the sheer scale was difficult to comprehend. Early reconstructions often overestimated the size, occasionally depicting it reaching 40 feet or more, partly due to the assumption that the head was proportionally smaller relative to the body than current models suggest. It took decades of careful comparative anatomy, comparing the fused dermal bones to better preserved smaller placoderm cousins to arrive at the more refined 20 to 33 foot estimate we use today. The structure of the Dunkleosteus head shield, when viewed close-up, reveals the complexity of its life. It's not just a flat piece of armor. The plates are riddled with lateral line canals, tiny sensory organs used to detect vibrations and pressure changes in the water.
This meant that the massive fish, which was likely a slow cruiser most of the time, could detect the frantic movements of a smaller shark or the propulsion of a massive nautiloid from a significant distance, even in the murky, deep Devonian waters. There's a bizarre duality to the Dunkleosteus. It was the ultimate weapon, but it was also fundamentally primitive. It was a cartilaginous fish wearing a bone suit. Because the tail and the rest of the body were composed only of cartilage, like modern sharks, that part of the skeleton rarely fossilized. This is why when you look at a Dunkleosteus fossil mount, you almost always see a massive, hyper-detailed head shield and then a reconstructed, often speculative body trailing behind it. We know the front half of this tank intimately. The back half is mostly guesswork, drawn from its short king placoderm relatives. This reliance on cartilage was a limiting factor, especially regarding locomotion.
Unlike the highly flexible, muscular, and bony-tailed predators that would dominate later eras, Dunkleosteus was likely not capable of prolonged high-speed chases. It was an ambush predator, relying entirely on that sudden, explosive burst of speed and the guillotine action of its jaw. If the initial strike missed, the prey likely had a decent chance of escaping, assuming it wasn't immediately shocked into catatonic submission by the sheer presence of the massive hunter. Why did this terrifying, perfectly engineered biological war machine vanish? This brings us to the late Devonian extinction event. It's tempting to think that such an absolute unit would rule forever, but life is often brutal and unforgiving, especially when the planet decides to change the rules of the game.
The late Devonian extinction was one of the big 5 mass extinctions in Earth's history, and it was complex and drawn out, spanning millions of years, characterized by several major pulses, notably the Kellwasser and Hangenberg events. The most widely accepted theories point toward global climate change, driven by shifts in sea level and, crucially for marine life, widespread anoxia, lack of oxygen, in the oceans. As massive plant life began to colonize the land and soil stabilized, huge amounts of nutrients were washed into the shallow seas. This triggered massive algal blooms. When these blooms died, their decay consumed vast amounts of dissolved oxygen in the deeper waters. Placoderms, including Dunkleosteus, were highly specialized creatures adapted for a very stable, shallow marine environment. They were heavily armored and arguably metabolically expensive to run. When oxygen levels dropped and the stable niches collapsed, these massive, slow-reproducing armored giants were unable to adapt. The extinction hammered the placoderms. They simply could not compete with the rising class of fish, the osteichthyes, or bony fish, the ancestors of nearly all modern fish. These new kids on the block were faster, more maneuverable, had lightweight skeletons, and possessed true, replaceable teeth, allowing for a much more varied and flexible diet. The placoderms, the kings of the Devonian, hit a wall. Their evolutionary path, heavy armor, fixed skull structure, rigid bone plates instead of true teeth, had reached its functional limit. They were perfectly adapted for a world that no longer existed. The last of the placoderms vanished entirely by the start of the Carboniferous period, about 359 million years ago. R.I.P. The reign of the biological tanks was over, and the lightweight, agile, toothy sharks and bony fish inherited the Earth.
We might still encounter a nope rope or two in the ocean today, but nothing with the geological gravity of a Dunkleosteus. Let's take a moment to reflect on what Dunkleosteus represents. It stands as a profound testament to convergent evolution and specialization. In a time before the emergence of massive terrestrial predators, before the giant reptiles and mammals, the aquatic ecosystem achieved a state of absolute, overwhelming predatory efficiency. Imagine the sheer evolutionary pressure required to produce a fish that literally grows its own crushing weapons directly from its dermal skull plating. It shows us that nature doesn't always need complex dental batteries to achieve extreme predation. Sometimes, a pair of self-sharpening hydraulic blades attached to an armored head is all you need to maintain dominion over the sea.
For those of you who appreciate the strange, the bizarre, and the truly massive organisms that history tends to forget, the ones that make the classic dinosaurs look almost tame, Dunkleosteus is your champion. It's the original absolute unit that laid the foundation for every large marine predator that followed, demonstrating the pure power of the apex slot. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into the world of ancient armored fish and the true meaning of nightmare fuel, please do us a huge favor. Hit that like button. It genuinely helps our channel navigate the murky algorithms and bring more lost worlds back to life. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to The Lost World for more incredible journeys through paleontology. The story of the Dunkleosteus reminds us that dominance is temporary, and the most perfectly specialized life form can be rendered obsolete by a simple change in oxygen levels.
While the placoderms are gone, their bony legacy, the first vertebrates to truly master the ocean's food chain, lives on in the fossil record, whispering tales of armor, speed, and bone-crushing force. Thanks for watching, and until next time on The Lost World.